and it describes well our speaker, who has served the public good not only through elective office, but through appointed leadership posts in government and important nonprofit organizations as well. She serves higher education, too, as an adjunct professor at the Georgetown Public Policy Institute, as a visiting fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and as a senior fellow at St. Mary's College of Maryland. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the boards of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation and the Points of Light Foundation, to name but a few. She frequently says that her commitment to public service was learned at an early age. When her uncle, President John F. Kennedy, was taken by an assassin's bullet.
Thank you. Thank you, President Knapp. It's great to be here at Washington Jefferson College and to be with each of you today. Thank you so much. And thank you for the painting of my father. I appreciate it so much. And that's a terrific quote about the GDP. I'm glad that you've all come out and to think about what a civil conversation would consist of. And I guess you came because why did you come? I mean, I'm actually kind of curious. Did you come because you like to hear about Robert Kennedy, or because you want to know about civil conversations, or because your teacher told you to come? All three? Actually, I'm kind of curious. Can I ask why you came? Could somebody tell me why they came? Is this going to be a conversation, or do you just want me to entertain you? I mean, that's always the question. I actually asked President Knapp. He said, Kathleen, they kind of want you to entertain them, so they don't want to actually answer any questions. So be aware of that. Do you have an answer back there? Yes?
I came to hear what you had to say.
Thank you. Yeah, to entertain you. That's usually the deal. Okay. So I'm going to ask you a couple of things. You don't have to answer it now, but I wish, if you have a piece of paper and a pencil, I would like you to think about it at least. What do you think the value, I can see this guy looking at me, why am I here? What do you think the value of a civic conversation is? Like, why would you even care that there is one? Like, you could have all sorts of things in life besides a civil conversation. So why do you want one? You have to write it down. You guys too. Everybody has to be involved. This is like an engaged. So why do you want one? Number one. It makes it easy, more interesting when you're listening to me, because I have a point to make and I want you to understand, do you agree with me or not? So that's number one, okay? And then number two, what are the characteristics that you would have to form in your own character to make that possible? So it's difficult sometimes to have a civil conversation, if you've ever tried. Have you ever tried to have one? I want to ask for a raise of hands. Have you ever tried? But if you ever have tried to have a conversation with somebody you disagree with, it's sometimes difficult. So I was wondering, what makes it, what kind of fortitude do you have you had to? Okay, write those things down, okay? And then you can, at the end of my talk, you can ask me questions and you can say whether you agreed with what I said or not, okay? Okay, now I'm going to start with a story about my father, about a very tough moment and what he did at that tough moment and why and then I'm going to talk about his previous experiences that got him the characteristics that allowed him to do what he did, all right? And why I think a civil conversation or a good conversation was possible. And it was more of a speech that he gave. So that this is in 1968, he was running for president, and it was April 4th, 1968, and Martin Luther King had been shot in Tennessee, in Memphis, and my father was campaigning in Indianapolis, and he landed in Indianapolis, and the mayor told him that he should not go into the inner city because it was too dangerous, and he didn't think he could be protected. And the police chief told him he shouldn't go into the inner city because he didn't think he could be protected. And they were correct. That assessment could be correct, because in 100 cities that night, there were riots that broke out. And in fact, in Indianapolis in that night, where my father was supposed to go, there were people with shotguns and things that they could burn. And so it was a dangerous place to go. So they were correct in advising him not to go. But he went anyway, because he said his campaign was about bringing peace and understanding to this country. And when he went there, half the people had not heard that Martin Luther King had been killed. Others had in the back of the audience, and they were really angry, and they wanted to start a fight. And he said to the guests in the crowd, Martin Luther King had been killed, and he had been killed by a white man. And there are those who may be bitter because he was killed by a white man, but his own brother had been killed. He said, my own brother had been killed by a white man, so I understand the bitterness that you might feel, and the hatred you might feel, and the sense of a desire for revenge. I understand that because I had those same feelings. And then he quoted Aeschylus. He said, let me quote my favorite poet, Aeschylus, the Greek poet. Pain which falls on your heart when you're asleep falls drop by drop upon your heart until in your own despair, against your will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. What we need in this country is not lawlessness. What we need in this country is not violence. What we need in this country is not hatred. What we need is a feeling of peace and justice and compassion for those who suffer, whether they be white or they be black. And please, let's help one another. And then he quotes again the Greeks, let us tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of the world. And that night, he asked them to say a prayer for themselves and for our country. And they left that crowd that could have broken out in incredible anger and burnt the city, went home in peace, and did not do that. And that was one of the few places in the whole country that had peace. And it was because my father, I think, had what you would say is a civil conversation, had courage to go into the city, and had the experience to be able to talk with people about a very difficult subject, that is the death of Martin Luther King, could bring his own experience into it, could quote the Greeks about pain and suffering and the horrible thing about death and what you could do instead of taking revenge, and ask them not to break out in violence, but ask instead for justice. Now that's a difficult conversation, I would say. So then the question is, and it was a successful conversation because there was peace and people didn't kill each other and didn't burn down the city. So then the question is, how does somebody come to that? How does a person who is born into wealth in Boston, Massachusetts, come to Indianapolis 42 years later and be able to have that kind of conversation? How do you grow into that? You're not born into it. You grow into being able to have those kind of conversations. You practice at being able to have those kind of conversations. How do you develop that? And so when I think about it, I think, obviously it took courage. That's easy. That's guts. Guts are going into difficult places. Guts are being able to pursue that. It also takes understanding where other people come from. It takes open curiosity, where do other people live? And it takes a lifetime of dedication to justice, to making sure that you have a reputation as to being truthful about what you're trying to accomplish. He was known to do that. So people had a sense of trust of where he came from. So let me tell you a little bit about my father's life so that you get a sense of what you have to do. You don't do it on the first day. It's not like, oh, today I'm just going to have a good conversation. It's hard work. It doesn't get there immediately. It takes starting when you're young. In fact, starting when he was in college. I'll tell you in a few minutes what he did when he was in college. But before I get there, I'll just talk to you about what I learned when I was young, 3 years old. One of his first jobs out of college was going after the mob. You've heard of organized crime, right? I'm trying to get some reaction from you. Awake! So when he was in 1954, you've heard of J. Edgar Hoover? Yes. Woo! Anyway, J. Edgar Hoover was head of the FBI, and he said there was no such thing as organized crime. How many of you knew that? You, 3 people, 4, 3 people, 4 people knew that. Good? Anyway, so in 1954, J. Edgar Hoover said there was no such thing as organized crime. My father, fresh out of the UVA law school, said, yes, there was such a thing as organized crime, and he decided to prosecute organized crime. My mother, the mother of, starting with me, the oldest, you heard that, thought it would be good, my parents thought it would be good, rather than take me to the playground, which most parents of 3- and 4-year-olds would do, swing on the swings, play in the sandbox, she took me to the Senate Racket Committee hearings. So my first words, I kid you not, were, I refused to answer that question on the grounds that it may tend to incriminate me. Because those mobs would keep saying, I take the fifth, I take the fifth, I take the fifth. Anyway, so my father was taking on organized crime, and that was very courageous of him. And eventually, about 5 years after he did that, J. Edgar Hoover did admit there was such a thing as organized crime. Once he got, I won't tell you why he did it, but basically he had gotten this, I must admit, an Italian to describe the organized crime that was going on in the Poconos. Anyway, enough of that. He and J. Edgar Hoover didn't get along. That's another story, but I'm going to tell you about it. And just to tell you how bad the mob was, when I went to Our Lady of Victory School, Catholic school, 45 kids in a class, 1 nun, and the threat of hell or heaven kept us in line. The mob threatened to throw acid in our eyes. And so I couldn't leave the school like the other kids. I had to go to the principal's office till my mother would pick us up. So we learned early on that if you wanted to do good, there was going to be consequences. That's courage. He still pursued the mob, even despite the threat against his children. I don't know if you would agree with that. But he was gutsy, my father was, and despite those threats, he pursued them. When he became the Attorney General, my father used to have this big dog. It seemed this big. It was a Newfoundland. Do you know what a Newfoundland is? I see you can answer some questions and just not others. Okay, Newfoundland, big dog, big gooey stuff hanging out of his mouth. So one day he decided to send us, by that time there were 7 kids, not just 3, and he sent us down to meet J. Edgar Hoover. And then J. Edgar Hoover hated gooey dogs. He was meticulous. And we went down to the FBI headquarters, and there was a box that said, do you have any, what are they called, suggestions? And my mother used to have little red cards which she still does at the age of 91, in the suggestion box, and my mother wrote, "Get a new director." Okay, that is not, what are we supposed to be talking about? That's an example of not to do. I have, yes, good stories and bad stories. Okay, my mother was not one of those delicate conversation people. So moving along, I'm just to show you that I know what's not to do and to do. Anyway, my point of this story is Daddy was gutsy early on and taking on organized crime when it wasn't popular to do. And I wanted to tell you that. And he was doing it even though his children were at risk and even though there were a lot of Edgar Hoover didn't want it to happen. So there was a gutsiness about my father. He also, so that's one story. And I think that you have to know that because part of what you want to do in life is try to figure out how you can be gutsy, how you can be, if you're going to take on good conversations, you have to figure out where your courage comes from. And it's hard to build that courage. And how can you practice that courage? The second aspect of what he did was the issue of anti-Catholicism. As you probably know from your history, my uncle John Kennedy was the first Catholic to become president. And there was a lot of anti-Catholicism during the 1960 campaign. But interestingly enough, when my father was in college, he went to Harvard College, there was a priest in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who used to preach that only Catholics could go to heaven. Have you ever heard that idea? And my father was completely horrified by that idea because he said, what kind of God would you have that would only allow one type of people to get to heaven? That would mean that people who happen to live in a part of the world that didn't know about Catholics, that hadn't seen a priest, would never get to go to heaven. That doesn't make any sense. Any God that created the world would allow everybody to be saved, not just Catholics. So he was so horrified by this priest that he went to Cardinal Cushing, who was the cardinal in Boston, and he got the priest defrocked. I love this audience. Anyway, so you could see my father early on had a sense of justice and a sense that, what did you think of that? Well, you didn't come to hear me tell stories you already knew, did you? Anyway, so the point is he early on had a sense that, you had to have a sense of justice and that everybody should have a fair shake, not just the people who were like him. I think that's what the point of this story was. And so he understood that, and there, I just wanted to make clear, that 1960 campaign was a very tough campaign. Nearby in West Virginia. West Virginia is pretty close here to here. I know my geography. And I'm so happy with myself. And in West Virginia during that primary, Hubert Humphrey's song, do you know what his campaign song was? I'm giving you an opportunity since you think that you were going to hear all my stories already. You were so surprised that you hadn't heard that story. His song was, "Give me that old-time religion." Do you think he was talking about Catholicism? No. So just to show you, he was using everything he got against my uncle. Luckily, the people of West Virginia liked my uncle better, or at least voted for him. The joke about that election was, my grandfather said, "I'm happy to help you, Jack. I just don't want to pay for a landslide." You have to make fun of yourself sometimes. Humor is a really good thing to do. That's another good part of good conversations. Don't be really self-righteous. If you can laugh at yourself, it helps a lot. And I think my family was very good at laughing at themselves. Because if you're really self-righteous, people don't like you very much. And you can't take yourself seriously all the time. So that's another good thing about good conversations. Anyway, but Norman Vincent Peale and Billy Graham seriously had sent out a letter in the 1960 campaign saying, don't vote for John Kennedy because we'll have a pope in the White House, pope controlling everything in the White House. And so it was a very serious problem. And John Kennedy then went to the ministers in Houston to say that, and said to them, you didn't ask me when I joined the military whether I was Catholic. You didn't ask the people, the Catholics of the Alamo, whether they were Catholic. You were willing to fight with them. So you cannot allow somebody just to be decided at the day that they're baptized whether they can be a real citizen of America. And that helped. But obviously it was a very close election. And he won that election in large part because Catholics voted for John Kennedy and African Americans. And that brings me to my third point of the story, which is going back to the Martin Luther King, how African Americans really made a difference in the 1960 election. And in large part, that was because, again, my family versus Nixon, who had been, before 1960, much closer to Martin Luther King than John Kennedy. But during a critical moment in that election, John Kennedy and my father really helped Martin Luther King. So I'll tell you that story, which I'm sure you know. It's okay. Knowing your history is fine. I'm all for it. So in the 1960 campaign, Martin Luther King, who was an activist at that time, was pulled over for speeding and sentenced to 4 months hard labor, which you all agree is ridiculous, right? And so this was in Georgia, and Sarge Shriver and Harris Wofford, Sarge Shriver's my uncle, and Harris Wofford, who just died about 2 weeks ago, and was a senator from Pennsylvania. And he was a great, great man. And he's going to have a ceremony for him on March 2nd. A really good friend, really good man. Anyway, he got John Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, to call Coretta Scott King, which he did. And my father was initially upset about that because he thought it would hurt him in the South. But then then that night he was thinking, this is so unfair that somebody would be sentenced to 4 months hard labor for a traffic violation, that the next day my father called the judge. Much more effective to call the judge. And he got him out of prison right away. So at that point, Dr. Martin Luther King Sr., Martin Luther King's father, well, first of all, Martin Luther King at that point could have endorsed John Kennedy, right? He had gotten him out of jail. That would be a nice thing to have done, right? Aren't you learning about democracy? President Knapp, there's a lot more education for your students. Anyway, Martin Luther King said, just because the politically expedient is the morally correct, I'm not going to endorse John Kennedy. Do you get that? He was very righteous, and he wasn't going to have anything to do with John Kennedy. He didn't think that was helpful. But his father instead said, I'll vote for a Catholic or the devil himself if he wipes the tears from my daughter-in-law's eyes. I've got a church full of votes for John F. Kennedy. Do you understand how prejudiced he was against Catholics? I'll vote for a Catholic or the devil himself. Don't you? So when John Kennedy heard that, he said, oh, that's really interesting that Martin Luther King has a bigot for a father. But I guess we all have fathers. Because John Kennedy's father, my grandfather, wasn't exactly free of challenges himself. So anyway, it really helped that Martin Luther King and African Americans came out very strongly in the 1960 campaign for John Kennedy. But it all comes from what you do in moments that are tough. And Richard Nixon had a much better relationship with John Kennedy, with Martin Luther King, but he was afraid and he didn't act. So again, it is courage at tough times that allowed that to happen. So think about yourself. When somebody says something that's racist or somebody does something that's bad or that you don't like, do you speak out? I remember being with my father in the cabs, and we would be going something, and the cab driver would say something that was bad, you know, like a racist joke. This happened a lot in the 50s and the 60s, and my father always said, don't say that. You know, he would always just say right away, don't do it. And it was just instinctual of him to always say, don't do it right away. And so the part of what we have to do is get accustomed to speak out, even if it's not popular, even if it's not easy, just to do it. Even in the littlest things, he would do it. And he did it when it was not popular. At the when he was at the University of Virginia Law School, he asked Ralph Bunche to come and speak, who was at the UN. He was African. And at the University of Virginia at that time, there was no place that would let somebody who was black stay at a hotel. So he stayed at my parents' house that night when he was speaking. And all night long, people in Charlottesville, no surprise, threw apples and oranges and rocks at my parents' house and screamed at them all night long. So here he was at law school, and they were already ready to scream at him. So my father was accustomed to being unpopular, is what I'm trying to say. So you can think about who would you invite and that's not popular, and that you would have stay at your house and be yelled at all night long. Do you get the point? It's like you're doing it, you're accustomed to having that happen. So he did that, and then he became the Attorney General. He didn't think it was going to be as bad as it was, that the racism in this country was as bad, even though he had had that experience at UVA. But it was as bad. He learned that there were no any lawyers in the Justice Department that were black. He insisted that they go out and get some. He didn't know that there were any U.S. attorneys that were black. He named 2. But one of the things that I think is really extraordinary, after the integration of the University of Mississippi and the University of Alabama, in 1967, he was then invited down to the University of Mississippi to give a speech at the law school. And when the regents at the University of Mississippi heard it, they called the law school and they said, we don't want, uninvite Robert Kennedy. We don't want him here. And the dean of the law school and half the faculty said, if you make us disinvite Robert Kennedy, we're going to quit. And my father didn't really want to go to the University of Mississippi because he knew he wasn't going to be too popular there, if you know the story. But when the dean of the law school threatened to quit, then he realized he better go, and the university took a vote. The regents took a vote as to whether they would allow Robert Kennedy, my father, to speak there, and it was a 5-4 decision. So he was allowed to come and speak. And he came down to the University of Mississippi. This is 1967. And he thought you should always speak to people who may disagree with you. And as you can imagine, they probably really disagreed with him. It was packed. In fact, they had to move it to the gym because it was so packed. And my father brought my mother because he thought that would help. And as they walked across the stage, he was holding my mother's hand. And I've been told this because they're making a film about it. They couldn't believe that he was holding my mother's hand because, you know, he was devil incarnate. And now he was holding a wife's hand. That's such a sweet thing to do. And then he gave a speech, and then he answered questions. And by the time he was answering questions about how Ross Barnett, who was the governor of Mississippi, had tried to make a whole scene out of the allowing James Meredith into the University of Mississippi. And it was such a ridiculous request. Like Ross Barnett wanted the guns to be out like this so it would look like that he had to be standing down. And the whole audience ended up laughing at Ross Barnett. And so Ross Barnett could never run for governor again. And the students at the University of Mississippi gave Daddy about a 10-minute standing ovation. That is an example of going into what is called territory that is not liked by you. You know, he was not going to be popular at the University of Mississippi, but he went there, he talked to the students, and he got a standing ovation. And afterwards, he had been wearing a pinstripe suit, and there was a rush to Brooks Brothers the next day. They had never seen anybody really in a pinstripe suit. I tell you these stories because I think it's important to understand that he did go into the places that he was not particularly popular, the University of Mississippi, even though they didn't really want him, but it was important to go to places where he wasn't wanted. And that whole sense of doing things that are difficult is an important part of conversations with people who you disagreed with. And I think it also comes from a sense of compassion for others. You know, you quoted, when you introduced me, what my father wrote me after my uncle died. When my uncle died, which was very tough for me, and really tough for my father, his brother, the person who was he was the attorney general for, had died. He was trying to organize the funeral. He didn't know what would happen to Jackie. He did not know what his own future would be like. He was doing everything. And yet on the day of the funeral, he had the courage to write a letter. And he made the time, "Dear Kathleen," he said, and this is what he wrote me, "Dear Kathleen, as the oldest of the Kennedy grandchildren, you seem to understand that Jack died and was buried today. You have a special responsibility to your family. Be kind to others, work for your country, love Daddy." Now, you can see he could have been filled with revenge and anger and bitterness, just as the people were when Martin Luther King were killed. And yet, he didn't use those words. He said, love and compassion, family, and work for your country. So he had understood right away that what you can do with all the terrible sadness and pain in your life, you always have a choice. Do you take it and use it against people, or do you say, let's try to understand and help others and create something better for our country? And I think that's really what you try to do in a decent democracy. I mean, I think that's what he taught me, and so when he went out, when Martin Luther King died, it wasn't a false speech, it wasn't a fake speech. It really came from his own experience of what he had done in his own life. And I think that's what each of us always have the choice to do. All of us have, opportunities to be courageous. All of us have pain in our life, obviously, whatever it is. We've all suffered enormous pain. And we all have the opportunity to see how we put ourselves in some other people's shoes. And my experience has been, it's more interesting if you do that than tell the other person they're stupid, or they don't get it, or they're terrible. I love the fact my nephew Joe, who's in Congress, we were with some other members of my family, and they were criticizing the people in Congress. And he said, you know, if you know where they come from, if you understand their experience, their lives make sense, and their choices make some sense. So rather than be so, I sound self-righteous now, but he was so understanding. If you understand where they come from, then you can have a much better and open conversation. So I think that's my question, you know, my request for each of you, because I think it's a much richer country when we can show compassion and love towards each other and still fight for justice. Thank you very much.